Hello and welcome to another episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. Today we have special guest Troy Leavitt. Troy, how's it going?
It's going well. You got me right on the show, right from the outstart.
Yeah, I figured that the little less banter from me as possible is better at the beginning. Today we're going to talk about something that I think is a conversation long overdue, because a lot of people, when we're in the world of ex-Mormonism, so a lot of people, they grow up in the Mormon faith, they eventually have problems with it, they leave, and then the world is wide open, all different ideas and everything they can accept and everything. And one of the things that kind of pops up and has been popping up more and more frequently is something which is specifically in opposition to something the Mormon Church teaches, which is this notion of agency and free will. The Mormon Church has a lot of pretty strong doctrine on this concept that each individual has agency. I mean, even if you want to talk about moral versus free agency, just the fact that they have agency becomes a kind of a foundational point in how Mormons conduct their lives. And you leave the church and suddenly everyone's like, well, there's actually no free agency. There's no free agency. And then there's all of these different arguments for it. And, behind a lot of those arguments is usually arguments for collectivism and authoritarianism in government, because that's just the conclusion that you have to do to overcome the lack of free agency. But tell me a little bit about what you're going to show us today, and then just get started, because I want to hear about it.
All right. So as we've kind of been covering all these different topics along the way, what it's like to be in the post-Mormon world, a topic that I hear come up a lot is, like you said, this idea of freedom, of whether or not you can do anything. And I noticed that a lot of our LDS or ex-Mormon influencers, and I'm gonna name a few here, like Bill Reel and Cara Burrell and Britt Hartley, all of these folks, I've heard them talk about how there's really no free will, that everything is determined, it's all causal, it's all necessary. And so the whole notion that we had as LDS folks, as Mormons, that we had some agency in what we were doing is really kind of just an illusion. And that lack of free will permeates, I believe, a lot of the ex-Mormon sphere, but I think it does so without the people who believe in that really having thought through the issues very deeply. To me, it feels like it's a reaction. I left the church. I used to be a free agent. I used to have this free agency, and now I can't believe in anything that I used to believe in. And so there's almost this desire to undercut free agency or free will. And so my position, being a non-member and having been out of the church for about 30 years now, a non-believer, is that you actually do have free will, but that you have to kind of think about what free will is. And that kind of knee-jerk reaction that you have right when you first come out of the church is kind of a shallow reaction. And so my intent today is to talk about free will, talk about the different types of free will, and kind of just give us a survey of how one might still be able to maintain a belief in free will, even though you've become more, say, scientific in your worldview. You've approached the world from a more materialist, scientific aspect. Yeah,
I can already hear the voices of people like, no, you just mischaracterized why I don't believe in free will. You gave a simplistic, reactionary explanation. And certainly when you go and you listen to the arguments, because all of them have a very, comprehensive set of arguments as to why there is no free will, it goes into things such as what it is that makes up how you would get to your choices, the both biological, social, and environmental factors that lead you to choose one thing or the other, or even limit the choices you can even potentially make. So I want to just upfront say, let's hear this out, because we know it's a complex conversation. It's not simply you left the church, so now anything that is the opposite of what the church taught is what you believe. That's not the case.
And much too shallow. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah. But it does make for a fun little zinger. So anyway, all right. So now you want to go into it, because I need to hear this.
Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen here, and hopefully this works out just fine. And let's see if you can see this. Do you see that?
Yes, here we go.
Good news, everyone. So free will exists, and I'm basically going to be evangelizing what's called compatibilism within free will. But as we walk through this, my intent here is not to make it like too heavy or too deep. This is more top line, big ideals. So let's talk a little bit about it. First of all, I wanted to start out by saying this is intended to be a friendly exploration of ideas. And this is this little quote here from David Hume, which you can see at the bottom. It's from his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, Section 8 of Liberty and Necessity. It's a very famous quote from Hume. Could you go ahead and read that for a second?
Yeah. Let's see. But to proceed in this reconciling project with regard to the question of liberty and necessity, the most contentious question of metaphysics, the most contentious science.
Yes.
The most contentious question of metaphysics, the most contentious science. You gotta unpack this for me.
Yeah. So, and I actually think that is a good question. Why did David Hume and a lot of other philosophers say, wait, free will is the most contentious question of metaphysics, the most contentious science? What's he getting at here? And I believe what he's getting at is that free will actually touches on pretty much everything we do as humans. And so the question of whether or not we have it and what it actually is a huge, huge area of potential philosophical exploration. Pretty much any philosopher who has ever dealt with philosophy at all, from the Stoics and the Greeks all the way forward through the Enlightenment over in China, it's always been about free will and what we have control over and what we do not. And so this is an area of tremendous potential rabbit holes to get into. We can get lost in all sorts of definitions, and I don't want to do that. I'm actually wanting to try and keep this fairly high level, talk about it more at an idea level, and not get too lost in the weeds of philosophy and terminology and that sort of stuff. This is more about the ideas behind free will, and also kind of a primer, so that if you're not really familiar with some of the main concepts of free will, hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be going, oh, I kind of get what this is about and where we're going with it. So I wanted to set that up. We're trying to be friendly and lighthearted here.
Okay, liberty and necessity is the term that is being used in that case for what we are talking about in terms of free will. Okay.
Yeah, David Hume, was using the term liberty for free will. Necessity is for causality or determinism. Which let's kind of roll along here. So, as to the question of why in the world is free will so contentious, it kind of starts here with the definition of what is free will. So why don't we take a look at these two definitions? So start with that first one at the top here,
okay.
The American Heritage Dictionary.
Definition number one is free will is the ability or discretion to choose, free choice. And then the example they give is choose to remain behind of my own free will.
Right. So there's one definition. Go ahead and read the second one.
Okay. Second one is the power of making choices that are neither determined by natural causality nor predestined by fate or divine will.
Which is kind of a strange one that doesn't, what exactly is that? How can you have a choice that's neither determined by causality nor predestined, or divine will? It seems to be kind of, that's a strange definition too, right? And then the third one there.
A person's natural inclination or unforced choice.
All right. So already in those definitions, and this is just, one example from the American Heritage Dictionary, you've got kind of this broad range of what free will even is. And I just want to walk through this because it leads into where we're headed, that a lot of problems with free will is just in figuring out what we're talking about. So go ahead and read that next one from Wikipedia as well.
Okay. So from Wikipedia, free will. Free will is the capacity or ability to choose between different possible courses of action. Free will is closely linked to the concepts of moral responsibility, praise, culpability, and other judgments which apply only to actions that are freely chosen.
Wow, what a loaded sentence there, right? What do they mean by freely chosen? Moral responsibility, praise, culpability. There's all sorts of stuff tied up in free will, which is what this slide I think I'm trying to get at, is that the reason that we care so much about free will is that it touches on all of these other things. In fact, it underpins all of this stuff. So let's maybe take a second here. So first of all, you've got the whole question of moral responsibility. If you're not really responsible for your actions, how can you do anything that's moral or immoral?
And
If
there's limits to this too, it would seem, just because the question of whether somebody understood the difference between right and wrong comes up legally, I think, in crime court cases and things like that.
Right. It's hard to know if we should lay the blame for somebody, the blame for an action on somebody, or if we should also even praise them for doing something well. If you don't have free will, if you're not making choices, if you're not in control of yourself, your decisions, should you have praise or blame? Which really gets down to the big question: are we fated or are we free? Do we have any say over what happens to us in our life, or are we free? So this isn't even about free will itself. This is about the implications of free will. We haven't even started talking about it. We're just like, wow, free will touches on everything it means to be human. And that is why it tends to be such an important and central feature of everything we do. And as we get into this, I think you'll start to really go, oh, wow, free will is it a super important subject. No wonder it's so contentious and people talk about it so much. So with that kind of caveat, I'm going to start, getting into the different stances. And as I said earlier, there are lots of different avenues that you can go down. So I'm just going to talk about kind of the three broad main categories. And I'm going to give a little bit of due to the first two, the libertarian position and the incompatibilist position. And then my stance is the last, which I'll spend most of the presentation on, which is that I'm a determinist, but I'm a compatibilist, which means I believe that we do have free will. But let's very quickly kind of hit the top line of what each of these are. So the libertarian notion of free will, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, is the idea that your free will exists independent of the material universe. And this is kind of the idea of the ghost in the machine, so that the decisions that you make are not bound up necessarily with anything that's going on in your brain prior. Instead, your brain or your will comes first. This is the idea of kind of like I've got a spirit that may have come down and is inhabiting my body, and so it has control over that body to a certain degree. It's that libertarian notion of completely free or almost entirely free of the physical constraints. So that's libertarian. It's also the one that's the most out of favor in philosophy right now, because it tends to postulate some sort of metaphysical substance like a spirit. The second one there in blue is the one that is most widely accepted, I think, by non-believers. And this is the position that we'll be talking about at some length from Sapolsky and Sam Harris, which is the idea that free will doesn't exist at all. It's all an illusion. And that's because everything is determined by the material universe. That means that everything that happens happened as a result of what came prior. We are basically machines of fate, which means that from the Big Bang, that everything got rolled into motion. It exploded out into the universe. The worlds formed. Everything congealed. And then over time, we developed, evolved into the beings that we are. And all of this is happening according to natural law. And now that we are conscious, our free will is still subject to all of those natural laws, going all the way back. Everything that goes into who we are was predetermined from even before we were born. Our position in life, from our economic status to our genetics, everything all predetermined. So therefore, there's no latitude and no room for any sort of actual choice to be made. It's all an illusion. So that's the incompatibilist view that views the world through determinism. And we'll spend a little bit more time on that just in a second, because that is kind of a dominant view that has to be addressed. And then the last view, my stance, and also the stance of most philosophers, interestingly enough, is the compatibilist view. And this is the idea that, hey, we do live in a materialist universe, just like the incompatibilists believe. However, we also have free will, and that is because our brains have evolved to be basically freedom engines, that they've allowed us to make genuine choices in the universe in which we live that are not entirely without what I guess you would call free will, without the ability to actually have some meaning in that choice, or some actual ability to make a genuine choice. So this is, and we'll talk about how that works and how that fits into everything in a minute. So anyway, those are the top three kind of broad stances. And I should say that there's a lot of overlap when you get into the weeds, a lot of different things. But what do you think about just kind of these general categories?
Well, I can't help but think about comparable religious concepts as you talk about them. On the libertarian one, there's like this notion of what is essentially a soul that inhabits your body, that is your internal agency. But you know, a lot of libertarians are atheists, and so while they would reject the notion of the soul, I think they still have this concept of your consciousness being a reality that involves your ability to make choices that aren't determined by any divine force or any chemical. It's, I mean, it's, you know, you're making decisions about complex things that it would be hard to say a chemical or a you know, a natural part of the universe could determine. So that's
Right.
kind of, it's an unusual lumping of libertarian philosophy in with that concept, but I think I understand what you're going with. And the other thing, you know, the dominant view of the atheist post-religious people is this determinist incompatibilist thing, but it sounds an awful lot like, you know, those various religious sects that basically say God already knows all of your choices and everything is already predetermined, and even your, you know,
Very
eternal
Calvinist.
resting
Yeah.
place, yeah, is
Yeah.
already predetermined. And so it's what reminds me of that. But I'm interested to see where you're going. I could, you know, disrupt this conversation by bringing up chaos theory and all these other things that, and quantum clouds of possibilities. You know, even just like when we deal with AI, like you can go and you can ask Gemini or Claude or Chat GPT a question and it'll give you an answer. And you can say, okay, I'm going to ask you the exact same question again. It'll give you a slightly different answer, or an answer that takes it from a different perspective, even though the input is the same. And there may be some parallels in terms of how those things get determined that might have a biological comparable principle. But I want to see where you go before I explore any of those ideas.
Yeah, this is all just kind of framing. We'll dive into some of those nooks and crannies as we go along. Let's start first at libertarian a little bit. Just spend briefly looking at that one. I should say that there is a difference between political libertarianism, you know, the political position, and philosophical libertarianism. These are really not related, although often you'll have people who are both libertarian politically and believe in libertarian free will. But libertarian free will is really a philosophical category, which is not related to the political category, and it just purely relates to this idea of agency, where that it is external to the workings of the brain, or that the brain is not. It's the idea that the brain may not be entirely responsible for free will. Although, again, you know, there are some discussions about. But the idea is that libertarian free will is not constrained by typical material processes. So that's why it's usually linked to a spirit, and why the LDS free agency is very similar to the philosophical notion of libertarian free will, generally speaking. That you've got something in you that is piloting around your body, and that something is what is making the choices, right?
Okay.
Then what happens, or what I think happens, is what I call that post-Mormon oikophobia. Oikophobia is the idea of something that you used to, you know, really care for, really love, you now totally hate and want nothing to do with it, and you're trying to push it away. Like, you know, a woman scorned is a way to think of that, is that, you know, I used to love this thing, but now I absolutely hate it, and I also have to kind of project that I hate it to make sure that everybody knows I have nothing to do with that. And so I believe that some of the rejection of free agency tends to lead our post-Mormon fellows right directly into that indeterminist. There is no free will. There's no free agency, and they are primed to reject any notions of people being able to make their own kind of unfettered choices because of that response. That's not necessarily the entire thing, but there's a rejection of that libertarian spirit notion of free will right away, I think, with many of them, unless they go and switch into another religion, right?
And anything that gives you fodder to be able to criticize Bednar in his talks. Of all the different general authorities, David Bednar has made this concept of agency one of his primary talking points, and so he'll frequently expound on it on his various visits locally. So if he's ever made the profit, we'll probably hear a lot more about it.
All right, so that's kind of the libertarian free agency. I'm not going to spend too much time there, just to say that it's the spirit and the ghost in the machine. This is the one where most people want to spend time, the no free will, the idea that it is incompatible. And I've got a lot of quotes here and stuff to talk about this, but the two books that I have listed up there are two excellent books if you want to get the arguments for incompatibilism and why There is no free will according to these guys. Actually have, like, here's Sam Harris's free will. And one of the things that I want to say about incompatibilism as we start to discuss it is it's actually a pretty easy concept to get. And you can tell from Sam Harris's book, which is really this thin little, it's practically a pamphlet. It's only about 80 pages. And that's because the idea is pretty easy to get. Yeah.
Okay. So you had determinism and compatibilism versus incompatibilism. And the determinism thing, I think I can get. It's that, our ability to make choices are rooted in the material reality of our biological selves and our environment to some extent. But where does compatible versus incompatible, just that term, how does it play into all of this so that I can conceptualize it better in my brain?
Yeah. So compatible, when we talk about compatible, it's whether or not free will is compatible with a determined universe, with a universe that is operating in accordance with natural law. And so the compatibilist view is, yes, you can live in a world that's determined and outgrowth by natural law and everything's happening, and you can have free will. The incompatibilist says no, it precludes free will. Any notion of free will that we think we have is purely an illusion. It's a survival mechanism that we've developed, but we're actually not making any real choices. Instead, we're just playing out our script, or basically we're fizzing out all the elements that have happened before to be who we are. And it's actually kind of a difficult thing to wrap your head around, because it feels like we have free will, but these guys are arguing, no, it's an illusion. So I actually think these quotes are worth reading. These are more conclusions. These are where they arrive at, more than explanations of why they think free will is incompatible. So go ahead and read Sam Harris is up on the left. Yeah.
Okay, up on the left. Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. We do not have the freedom we think we have. And that's Harris. And then we can go to Sapolsky. We are nothing more or less than the cumulative biological and environmental luck over which we had no control that has brought us to any moment. And then again, from Determined, you cannot decide all the sensory stimuli in your environment, your hormone levels this morning, whether something traumatic happened to you in the past, the socioeconomic status of your parents, your fetal environment, your genes, whether your ancestors were farmers or herders. Let me state this most broadly, probably at this point too broadly for more readers. We are nothing more or less than the cumulative biological and environmental luck over which we had no control that has brought us to any moment. So that's kind of an expansion of that first quote.
Yes. Yeah. So this is really that position of you're a meat robot, right? And I've got a little bit of Bender there off to the side, but that you're just being driven entirely by forces beyond your control, and you are, in Haidt's term, you're the rider on top of the elephant, that you have very little control over anything that's going on. And it's mostly, and there are some studies that tend to support this, that most of what you think as your decision-making process is happening even before you're aware of the decision to be made. For example, there have been tests where they'll say, hey, we want you to pick either this vertical stripe of lines or this horizontal stripe of lines. And you'll think, and you'll go, oh, well, I'll pick the vertical stripe of lines. And the thing is that the guys who are watching your brain on an MRI will know in advance which one you're going to pick, because they can see the stirrings of your neurobiology happening before you are even aware that you have made a choice. And so they can predict your choice before you are aware of your choice. And this creates a whole notion of, well, how in the world could that be? How can I make choices if it's already being determined before I'm even aware of the choice? So that's, it's a very compelling case from both free will and determined. And if you read those books, especially the front half of both those books, I think you'll come away with going, oh my goodness, yes, there is no free will because of these reasons. That we are just constrained by our biology and the natural laws and our history. But that runs into a big problem, which is my next slide. What happens, as we talked about earlier, with all the free will discussions, is you start running into this question of, responsibility. Well, wait, am I responsible for my choices or not? Where's the locus of this? What does it even mean to be responsible if I can't make choices, right? And so I've got a bunch of quotes, some on the left from Sam and some on the right from Sapolsky. And I think these are worth reading because they're a little bit grim. They're a little bit, a little bit of, this is the worldview of indeterminism or of incompatibilism. Sorry.
Incompatibilism. All right. So in the upper left-hand corner, Sam Harris. The men and women on death row have some combination of bad genes, bad parents, bad environments, and bad ideas. And the innocent, of course, have supremely bad luck. Which of these quantities exactly were they responsible for? No human being is responsible for his genes or his upbringing, yet we have every reason to believe that these factors determine his character. Our system of justice should reflect an understanding that any of us could have been dealt a very difficult hand in life. In fact, it seems immoral not to recognize just how much luck is involved in morality itself. This is invoking the whole, I'm a victim of society.
Right.
I am purely the result of the society around me, and therefore cannot be blamed for my actions. Which is kind of like the extreme notion that he's at least saying, we need to take that into consideration. So let's look at his next one. All right. Quote, my choices matter, and there are paths towards making wiser ones, but I cannot choose what I choose. And if it ever appears that I do, for instance, after going back between two options, I do not choose to choose what I choose. There is a regress here that always ends in darkness. What is he trying to say there?
Yeah, that's a good quote, especially from Sam Harris. The regress here that always ends in darkness. I believe that what Sam is making a reference to is that whenever you self-examine and pay attention to your own thoughts, which he advocates for a lot in his meditation practice, is that you start to discover that your thoughts kind of bubble up out of seemingly nowhere. That your thoughts are often just kind of being produced by your brain, and you just become aware of your thoughts. And that's what I think he's getting at. The regress here always ends in darkness, that you always start going back, well, where did that thought come from? I don't know. And when you pay attention to yourself and the thoughts that you have, you do discover that this is indeed the case, that a lot of your thoughts, if not most or all of them, seem to regress back into darkness, where you're not sure where that thought came from, how it got started, or how it even impacted you. And I think that what Sam is getting at here is that the empirical experience of life is that you're not really even in control of your thoughts, that even the choices that you're making seem to be happening below the level of you really being aware of how you're making them. And that's
I'm reminded of the Freudian concept of the ego and the id. And is this just a new expression of that type of division between our conscious and our subconscious mind?
Yes, yeah, I think that's exactly what he's getting at, is that we think that we're making decisions at a conscious level, but they're probably being made at a subconscious level over which we don't have control. Therefore, why pretend like we have control? That's kind of his position.
It's ominous that he uses the word darkness as though like there's some demonic force within all of us that are doing it. But it sounds more like it's just the regress always ends in just a void over which we have no way of understanding or putting our finger on what's causing our ideas, our choices. Okay, so let's take the next one. This one from Sapolsky and Determined. This book has a goal: to get people to think differently about moral responsibility, blame, and praise, and the notion of our being free agents, and to feel differently about those issues as well. And most of all, to change fundamental aspects of how we behave.
Yeah, Sapolsky in his book actually spends a fair amount of time talking about how he believes the justice system needs to adapt and change to, people basically being blameless for their actions to a degree. He recognizes that the locus of the problem is usually somebody did something wrong, but because of all these other factors, he works very much towards saying we need to rethink how we approach our whole justice system. However, and I think this next quote gets to where he kind of ends up. It's in the same book. So go ahead and read that next quote.
We're at loggerheads. There's no such thing as free will, and blame and punishment are without any ethical justification. But We've evolved to find the right kind of punishment viscerally rewarding. This is hopeless.
Right. So Sapolsky, as he's working through this, trying to figure out what we're responsible for and what we're not, he's got that position. Well, there's no free will, there's no blame or punishment, but my goodness, it sure feels like we have free will. It sure feels like we've evolved to want to punish people, to want to assign attributes to people. It's viscerally rewarding. Like he says, this idea of justice and blame and punishment, it's all built into us. It goes back. This is hopeless. How are we ever going to get to change to what he feels is a true notion of free will, because it's so baked into us that we feel like we are making these decisions. And so he feels it's kind of a maybe even hopeless endeavor, which is kind of funny that he writes a book trying to get people to change, but then comes back around to saying it's just so baked into us, I don't know how we get around it.
That's the inherent question to the first quote, is that he wants people to think differently and to act differently, and he's going to do that by informing them with the idea that once you get new information, you can consciously change what would otherwise be the natural mechanical impulses of your brain, which is somewhat of an expression of free will. Anyway, so take us to your next point, because this is a lot of food for thought.
Okay. I also included that picture there of Fry drinking a can of Slurm. And then that particular episode, Fry ends up addicted to the Slurm and really can't stop, which is kind of funny. But it's also a reference I've heard Jacob Hansen say several times, that in the materialist universe, the brain is just a pop can fizzing. It's just fizzing out, right? It's fizzing out what it's supposed to do. And so there is no real notion of free will. So kind of hitting both of those ideas that maybe we are just pop cans fizzing out if we live in the world of Sapolsky and Harris. It gets worse. So as we follow Sapolsky's idea and Harris's ideas, they have started doing some tests of cognition about free will and how it impacts what people do. And there have been several tests now, and this is one that I have over here on the side from June of 2016, where they do tests doing things very similar to some of the economic little games that we did earlier, back when we did a game theory discussion. They actually do those and tests on free will. And the idea is that they will give groups of people like a lesson on kind of you do have free will, and then a lesson on, oh no, you don't have free will, and then run them through economic tests afterwards to see if they can get a statistically significant difference in influencing how people come out. So go ahead and take a look at that paper and maybe read the abstract, because it tells you what they discovered from at least that one test, and there are many others.
Okay, so this is the article titled "Believing There Is No Free Will Corrupts Intuitive Cooperation," and the abstract. Regardless of whether free will exists, believing that it does affects one's behavior. When an individual's belief in free will is challenged, one can become more likely to act in an uncooperative manner. The mechanism behind the relationship between one's belief in free will and behavior is still debated. The current study uses an economic contribution game under varying time constraints to elucidate whether reducing belief in free will allows one to justify negative behavior, or if the effects occur at a more intuitive level of processing. Here we show that although people are intuitively cooperative, challenging their belief in free will corrupts this behavior, leading to impulsive selfishness. If given time to think, however, people are able to override the initial inclination towards self-interest induced by discouraging a belief in free will. People are able to override the initial inclination towards self-interest induced by discouraging a belief in free will. That is interesting, and I'm trying to imagine if we're seeing the tangible results of that in the various communities of the post-religious world that have accepted and internalized this rejection of free will. Do they, in fact, start to act in more of these, selfish, self-interested, impulsive, selfish ways? I don't know. That's worth ponderizing.
That is what the paper strongly suggests, right? Is that when people are exposed to the idea of, oh, I don't have free will, it becomes easier for them to justify kind of selfish or negative behavior because they're like, oh, well, I really don't have to think about this too much. It's just my impulse, and they go with it. And then it also notes in the paper, though, but if given time to think, they override that inclination and they come back to being cooperative. So there's kind of this interesting notion that, oh, we're inclined to be naturally cooperative towards working towards each other. It's almost our intuition. It's our instinct, right? Oh, but then if you tell people, you don't have free will, your choices don't really matter, they start to use that, according to this paper, as a way to justify more negative behavior. And so they'll actually suppress their natural inclination towards being cooperative and nice and be a little more selfish once they stop believing in free will, at least temporarily. But then if given time to think, they'll come back around. I think that's a very fascinating kind of discovery about how people's brains work, as just their beliefs influence their behavior that quickly.
No, I think that's actually a major theme of the subjects I try to cover on this channel, is that beliefs and ideas can absolutely shape your choices and your actions. So I can totally see this having some application there. There's a couple of other quotes. Is this a Sapolsky study? Is that why this? I guess the quote is from Determined. I don't see the author on that study.
Yeah, the study it's cognition. So this is from the journal. So I'd have to look up, dig up who the authors, but there are multiple authors of that paper. So they actually did a study. So you can look it up if you look up volume 151, cognition. And there's also a bunch of other studies that are similar in this Journal of Cognition that you can look up. But I put that up there because Sapolsky is aware of these studies.
Okay, yeah, it does sound like he's referencing this outcome. So in the first quote there, he says, thus undermine someone's belief in free will, and they feel less of a sense of agency, meaning, or self-knowledge, less gratitude for other people's kindness, and most important for our purposes, they become less ethical in their behavior, less helpful, and more aggressive.
Right, so they
I'm going to write a book all about it and make sure everybody loses their belief in free will.
Yeah, and that's kind of funny that he is aware that this actually happens to people, but he's still advocating for it because he wants, or he feels that it would be better if people kind of gave up their false notion of free will and realigned our justice system to take into account that people aren't really responsible for anything that they do. Which then leads to the next quote, which is not from one of his books. I think it's from one of his interviews. But this is basically him giving up.
Oh, really? I can't really imagine how to live your life as if there is no free will. It may never be possible to view ourselves as the sum of our biology. Perhaps we'll have to settle for making sure our homuncular myths are benign and save the heavy lifting of truly thinking rationally for where it matters, when we judge others harshly.
Right. So the funny word homuncular is a reference to homunculus, which is the idea of a small demon or a little being that lives up inside your brain that is the actual source of free will. So, it used to be the idea that, inside your brain is like a sub brain or, something where a homunculus lives, which can evaluate all the inputs coming in. And so that's the idea of dualism, the idea that you've got a ghost in the machine. Is the same idea, and he's calling it a homuncular myth. The idea of a ghost in the machine, it's a homuncular myth, and we'll just treat that as benign. We'll say it's still really the case, but we'll save our rational thinking for where it really matters, when we are in the justice system and how we need to judge other people. That's kind of where he goes, I believe, ultimately. Again, I'm treating this very lightly, very, there's a lot more depth, and I encourage people to get in to read this, but the general thrust is that they make a strong case that there's no free will, but then they recognize, this has a real impact on people. What do we do about it? And you end up in this problematic state of, if there is no free will, what do we do about that as a society? And should we be advocating for that? What are we doing here, right? Which gets us here. Finally. We're going to rescue ourselves from this position. And so here's from the Wikipedia, which I think this first paragraph does a really good job of kind of breaking out. some of what compatibilism is all about. And so as we turn the corner now, and the rest of my presentation is going to be about what compatibilism is, how you can have free will in a deterministic universe, and what it means. From here forward, we'll be talking about kind of what this means in contrast to what we've discussed so far. So this may be another use. Yeah, another use for reading and comment here.
All right. Good news, everybody. Compatibilism is the belief that free will and determinism are mutually compatible, and that it is possible to believe in both without being logically inconsistent, because as philosophers, nobody wants to be logically inconsistent. As Steven Weinberg puts it, I would say that free will is nothing but our conscious experience of deciding what to do, which I know I am experiencing as I write this review, and this experience is not invalidated by the reflection that physical laws made it inevitable that I would want to make these decisions. The opposing belief that the thesis of determinism is logically incompatible with the classical thesis of free will is known as Incompatibilism. Compatibilists believe that freedom can be present or absent in situations for reasons that have nothing to do with metaphysics. In other words, that causal determinism does not exclude the truth of possible future outcomes. Because free will is seen as a necessary prerequisite for moral responsibility, compatibilism is often used to support compatibility between moral responsibility and determinism. Similarly, political liberty is a non-metaphysical concept. Statements of political liberty, such as the United States Bill of Rights, assume moral liberty, the ability to choose to do otherwise than what one does. All right. I really like the definition of compatibility framed between those two things. That it's, the compatibility between the reality of determinism and the thesis of free will is kind of where that compatible versus incompatible word hinges.
Right. I'm going to dive in a little bit here into helping to kind of frame up what compatibilism is with as it ties in. But the main sentence in here that I think was really beautiful says causal determinism. It's in the middle of that second paragraph. Causal determinism does not exclude the truth of possible future outcomes. That little sentence right there is actually very key to understanding compatibilism, because a lot of what compatibilism is about the indeterminacy of the future and our interface with it. As we're looking ahead into the future, that's what free will is really engaged with, is instead of the back, behind us, everything that's happened in the past, that's all locked in. We can't change any of that. We have no say over that. And that's where our incompatibilists, the determinists, are absolutely right? That is locked away. But as we go forward into the future, our brains are engaged in modeling future outcomes. And the truth of those possible future outcomes are all genuine. They could happen provided upon what we do. And that's a lot of where compatibilism works in, is it's looking to the future rather than to the past. And if you start to get some of that in your head, it'll start to make sense about where we're going with what free will is and is not. So here's my next slide to help us make sense of it. This is really kind of a summary, but to help us make sense of those earlier pictures that I laid out. So compatibilism is cool with determinism. It fits right in with determinism, and it is not in any way in misalignment. So that's why I've got, Zoidberg down there going, hey, compatibilism is a subset of determinism, whereas libertarianism is off on its own side. And I put that little thing of Zoidberg saying, not you. Compatibilism is not a bridge. It is not intended to be a bridge between determinism and libertarianism. But sometimes you see it treated that way, like Sabine Hassenfelder, or whatever her name is. When she goes after free will, she goes down that same rabbit hole of thinking that compatibilism is somehow a mixture of a deterministic universe with an indeterministic universe, and we mix it all together and compatibilism pops out. That's classic compatibilism. Does not deal with determinism or indeterminism in that way. It's instead it's just saying, hey, it is completely consistent with the deterministic universe and does not rely upon some sort of magical stuff coming in and introducing new elements into our universe. Does that make sense?
I mean, to some extent, because I'm thinking about the different examples that get brought up when they discuss how free you are, and so frequently things like depression will be brought up, where they'll say that there are both environmental and biochemical factors that are inputs to whether or not somebody has the experience of depression, and that can affect the choices that they make. And so if you're looking at it from what you described as that libertarian philosophical perspective, how do they, with the concept of a soul or a ghost in the machine, deal with that issue? I mean, do they believe that, do they say, no, there is no biochemical thing that can affect your internal soul and give you the experience of depression, or how do they square that particular example?
Yeah, so if you're talking about libertarianism, that would be that if there is a soul, that it would be being constrained by the brain in some way, right? If you're libertarian, but if you're compatibilist, as we go down the line, a lot of that will actually turn into, it's not about the binary of whether you have free will or not. It's more about degrees of free will, which is what we're moving into next. That in order to kind of get this free will notion, you have to stop thinking about whether free will is a switch that you turn on or off, and start thinking about it in terms of free will as something that you can have more or less of. And when you start thinking about it that way, you can start to say, oh, well, when I'm depressed, well, I might have a little bit of free will, a little bit of ability to do some stuff, but a lot of it might be layered on by my circumstance. But what little bit of free will you have, you can actually wedge open and get more of, which we'll talk about how to do that as we go along. But just the idea is present there. Anyway, sorry, I'm kind of getting off in the weeds a bit.
No, that's good, because this is one of the word games that I feel comes up a lot of the time, is that someone will first encounter this arguments against free will. And one of the things that will be brought up is that, like, anytime you make a decision, there are an infinite number of decisions that you potentially could make, but then you're given a menu of only 5 decisions. So already you don't have free will, because free will it's almost like they define the notion of free will so expansively that you basically have to be a god unconstrained by reality in order to truly say you have free will. But nobody's arguing that basically, I think in this argument, a lot of people are just saying, hey, do I have a steering wheel or not? Or is somebody else driving? And so even if you take that, that comparison, then you could say, well, then even in the best of circumstances, people don't have infinite free agency. You're always working with a limited set of choices and options. And then, as you're saying, there are various degrees of limitation in your agency that you may encounter, and that, I think, makes sense.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That really what it starts to look at is kind of top down versus bottom up. When it's bottom up, that's emergent, where it comes up and it's constrained by everything that's gone before, but it builds up from the bottom. Whereas top down, it's like you said, it's the idea that you'd have to have a complete knowledge of all your possibilities before you could execute any sort of reasonable free will. And because you never have that, you never have unconstrained free will. You always are being constrained. And so they get into that whole idea, well, you don't have free will, but they're thinking top down. But if you're thinking bottom up as an emergent process, something that's being generated by your brain, something that's coming out, something you want more of, the ability to have more choices, the ability to do more things, then you start thinking of it as something that is not just a binary switch. And that emergence, yeah,
that's a good concept.
Let's take a step on this, because it's pretty important to get the idea of emergence as it relates to the fundamental, what I think is the category error that incompatibilists have made. We'll talk about that in a minute. But
so I can read this. In philosophy, systems theory, science, and art, emergence occurs when a complex entity has properties or behaviors that its parts do not have on their own, and emerge only when they interact in a wider whole. Emergence plays a central role in theories of integrative levels and of complex systems. For instance, the phenomenon of life, as studied in biology, is an emergent property of chemistry and physics. In philosophy, theories that emphasize emergent properties have been called emergentism.
Right, fancy word there. The The phenomenon of life as studied in biology is an emergent property of chemistry and physics is a beautiful illustration of emergence in process. Because, at a basic level, we're all just, made up of cells that are made up of molecules that are made up of atoms, but somehow we've arrived at a state of what we call life. It's a larger, more emergent property that comes as a result of all these things interacting and coming together. Free will is an emergent property of brains in a similar way. That's the contention that compatibilism is trying to make. It's you won't find it at the level of a single neuron. You won't find free will, in just one little corner of the brain or something. Instead, it's an emergent property of the whole brain acting as a system to come up with possible potential futures, outcomes, and actions. So what this means, and here's our brain slugs.
Yes.
Yes. So compatibilism basically sees the brain as a freedom engine. That's what it's engaged in doing. So in the same way that consciousness is an emergent property of brains, right? We have brains. You won't find a particle of consciousness or a source of consciousness. Instead, your whole brain is engaged, and you end up with this phenomenon of consciousness emerging from your electro-neurobiological process there. Intelligence is very similar too. It's hard to say, well, what exactly is intelligence? You don't have intelligence particles. Instead, it's a complex interaction. You've got linguistic intelligence, you've got mathematical intelligence, you've got social intelligences, all this stuff. It's all emergent from your brain, and free will is in that same kind of category. It's at the upper level of something that is produced by your brain when it's in a healthy state, or that's really what your brain is all about. It's trying to generate more opportunities, more freedom for you in the compatibilist worldview. So,
and for people that aren't aware of the brain slugs in Futurama,
yeah, that's a pretty good episode there, where I guess Hermes gets a brain slug from the brain slug planet, and they come back and start infecting all of the various members of the crew, and they basically just slap on your head and then just get complete control over anybody, and they actually form a brain slug party, which is what Fry and Leela are showing up here. Hello, would you like to join the brain slug party? And oh yes, sure. Slap the brain slug on you, and you will now be controlled by the brain slug from here on forward.
And suddenly all of your choices have the secondary effect of benefiting brain slugs. So you have to take off helmets and hats and promote brain slug concepts.
Yeah, it's kind of a beautiful metaphor for how a political ideology can just completely take over your brain until it's at the point that you're not even the person that you thought you were before. They make fun of it in that Futurama episode pretty well. All right, so now we've moved all the way to our favorite guy, Dan Dennett, who died and was a big part of why I wanted to do this series with you. He died, I think it was about 3 or 4 months ago. And so Dan Dennett is a major advocate for the modern version of compatibilism. And he wrote a book called Freedom Evolves. And although I just happen to have it right here, and even I have to do this, because we're on there it is. That's also a signed copy.
Hold on, let me see. Signed copy. Nice. So Troy.
Yeah, Dan Dennett was incredibly kind. A little side story about Dan Dennett. For a while, I was giving out books every year at Christmas time to friends and family and coworkers. And one of the years, I read his book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, and I thought it was so good that I wanted to give away copies of it to my friends and family. And I decided I wanted to give away signed copies. So I contacted him by mail and said, hey, Dan, I'd like to buy a bunch of your copies, and I'd like to get them signed. How about I send you a whole bunch of copies of your own book that I'll buy on Amazon, and maybe you can sign them, and then I'll pay for you to ship them to me. And he's like, sure, no problem. So I sent them to him. He signed all the copies and then paid for them to be sent to me. So he was totally cool about that. And I ended up getting about 25 signed copies of Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And some of these I think are still out in the wild. So, there he is. He's signed a bunch of those too. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out because Dan Dennett is one of the new atheists, but he's also, as we've talked about him before, he's the atheist who was most receptive, I think, to the role of religion in people's lives and was encouraging people to think deeply about religion. His other topic that he talked a lot about was free will. And so here we are with Dan Dennett's definition of free will. And what we've realized, I think, through this discussion so far is that it's hard to define even what free will actually is. And so I'm going to move ahead now with Dan Dennett's ideas around what free will is, because I think they're more coherent than what we've discussed so far. This is a way to kind of say, this is what we're talking about now when we talk about free will. So go ahead and kind of run through that.
Okay, according to Dennett, free will is an ability to see probable futures that seem like they're going to happen, in time to take steps so that something else happens instead.
Right.
Free will increases. Well, okay. Do you have some comment on that one?
Yeah. This is a key part of that look ahead idea that Dennett promotes as key to free will. That you're always engaged in this looking ahead at futures, and that's what the free will engine is engaged in. That's what we're all about. And then he says, in order to take steps so that something else happens instead. That's the idea of evitability. That next thing where it says free will increases evitability. Dan talks a lot about the difference between inevitable, where you can't avoid something, it's gonna happen, it's fate, and evitable, which is the notion that he says is really closest to his idea of free will, which is the idea that you can predict or you can see outcomes, and by modeling in your head what that might be, you can evade them. It's evitability. And he ties that into the whole history of evolution, which is what the book Freedom Evolves is about, is that going all the way back to our very early ancestors, the idea was that our very earliest brains, our earliest systems of neurons, were to increase evitability, were to increase the ability to evade these outcomes that as an organism you didn't want to have happen. And in order to do that, we had to start developing this look ahead ability as ancient organisms that has then continued to evolve until we've got a nice, robust brains that are now capable of having what he feels is very wonderful free will. It's something that we want to have and want to have more of, and we should be happy that we have it. So then let's look at this last thing, which I think is a pretty good synopsis of Dan Dennett's definition.
All right. The ability of rational agents to act out of self-determination, to select actions from a broad set of possible alternatives based on rational expectations of their consequences.
So what do you think of that? There's a lot in there.
No, there is. And, as you're invoking his approach to this, taking that evolutionary turn, that it makes sense that this is in that category of emergent, an emergent framing of how our free will happens, because we've seen a lot of the evolutionary processes are kind of that bottom-up emergent sort of category. And, the concept of free will as you discuss it is kind of ethereal, but when you say in practical terms, what does that actually mean in your day-to-day choices? And it really is, your ability to assess an environment, a situation, and to conceptualize internally what the outcomes of various different choices are make, and to select one and act on it. And all of these things are kind of happening internally, invisibly to you until you take some time and reflect on it. But this is not to say that there are not involuntary mechanisms that we experience, the most obvious of which would be something like, when you go to the doctor and they test your reflex, they give you a stimulus on your knee and then you kick. And, the neurologists that have studied that process determine that that's a decision that gets made at the spinal cord level. It never actually even goes to your conscious brain, but it's part of your human biology. And by the same token, there are other stimuli that have responses that are automatic, that you're not imagining some futures. It's just that evolution has determined that this is a way to affect how you will behave. So the fight or flight response that goes along with your autonomic nervous system, has some involuntary components over which you don't have agency, and they're not reflected in, determining and making rational considerations, but they can go into your level of alertness, your level of mental agitation that may actually affect the choices that you make. But when we're talking about this free agency, a lot of the times it really is, you have a choice. You can imagine different outcomes, and you make a decision with a goal of trying to realize a potential outcome based on information that you have. So I think I understand that.
Yes. What you're getting at there, and what Dennett talks about, or what I think you're getting at there, is that what we are aware of as conscious agents, as conscious beings, is really only the things that we might be able to influence or interact with. It consciousness and our free will, or our choice-making apparatus, is only being interfaced with things that we can do. In other words, let me give you an example. For example, I have control over my hands, right? I can move my hands around. I have some sort of neural control over that, but I have like no control over, say, my kidneys, right? I can't even really feel them, but they're in there doing their thing. So up here in my brain, it has become, thanks to evolution, there is an advantage for me to be able to manipulate things with my hands, but there was no advantage or evolutionary pressure for me to develop the ability to manipulate my kidneys, right? So there's kind of this notion that within our capacity for free will, or our range of what we can do, it is quite limited, but it's limited to the things that matter, to the things that the outcome is actually important to us. And evolution has kind of made sure that that's what we pay attention to. Most of our conscious experience is engaged with our social status and how we relate to other people and what we're doing in the world and that sort of stuff, and not at all concerned with like the pumping of our blood, or our breathing, or these other things that the brain is happening at a completely subconscious level, right? So there is a reason for us to be conscious of things. Why would we be conscious of stuff if not to make decisions or to act on it, right? That's the whole idea behind why we're conscious at all of some things and not of others. All right, so this is where I think you can start to see the incompatibilist wheels come off a little bit. Sam Harris actually addresses this, or tries to address this issue, in his book Free Will towards the end, which is the idea that in our justice system we deal with degrees, and we look at criminal offenses and we try and assess how serious was that, how much freedom did they have in it, or how much forethought, and then we assign punishment or blame based on what we feel that was. So I actually think it's really worthwhile to go through this exercise and try and say, what the heck is going on between these different degrees of murder, and why do we relate them? What's different about them? Why even have these differences, right? So let's walk through them very briefly, or and maybe talk about what makes them.
Do you want to start with the most agency or the less agency? Start from the top or start from the bottom?
Well, let's start from the top, which is
okay.
Yeah, so first degree murder.
First one is first degree murder. Any intentional killing that is willful and premeditated with malice aforethought. Felony murder, a charge that may be filed against a defendant who is involved in a dangerous crime where a death results from the crime, is typically first degree, but may also be second degree.
All right, so first degree, a planned forethought murder, right? We all kind of agree that it's premeditated. That's first degree. We tend to go, oh man, that's probably the worst case of murder. You thought about that. But then we have a different case, and we've got another case. Somebody's dead. Let's look at second degree murder.
All right, second degree murder. Any intentional killing that is not premeditated or planned. A situation in which the killer intends only to inflict serious bodily harm, knowing this could result in death, but with no specific intent to kill. It constitutes depraved heart murder, which can be considered as second degree murder.
Yeah, I'm not sure
what. Not somebody who's planning to do it. It just is something that may happen where they maybe didn't even intend to kill someone, but they took actions which they knew could result in death, and that would fall into that category.
Yeah, it's kind of I meant to really hurt them, but I didn't mean to kill them, and so we say, well, we're going to back off a little bit then, right? In terms of, we're going to say that's second degree. That's not first degree. You still killed them, but you didn't really mean to, or you didn't premeditate. What the heck? Why do we do that? What's going on there? Let's keep going through the list, because
okay.
I want to get to what
voluntary manslaughter. So voluntary manslaughter, sometimes called a crime of passion, murder, and informally called third degree murder. This is any intentional killing that involves no prior intent to kill and which was committed under such circumstances that would cause a reasonable person to become emotionally or mentally disturbed. Both this and second-degree murder are committed on the spot under a spur-of-the-moment choice, but the two differ in the magnitude of the circumstances surrounding the crime. For example, a bar fight that results in death would ordinarily constitute second-degree murder. If that same bar fight stemmed from a discovery of infidelity, however, it may be voluntary manslaughter.
So that's interesting. Yeah.
That is, because they're acknowledging that there's something about your emotional state which affects your ability to make rational choices.
Yes. Good. That's exactly. You picked up on the right thing, which I think Sam Harris completely missed. Right. So Sam Harris, when he looks at this, he says the difference is in intentionality. He looks at it and says, well, you know, they intended to kill in the first one. They didn't intend to kill in the second one. And he kind of glosses over the third one and says, oh, it's intentionality. So that's the difference. But I suggest to you that it's not intentionality. It's control. It's, did you have the capacity or the autonomy over your own body at that time? Or did you lose your free will? Did you lose your control in that crime of passion? And that does speak to this idea of degrees, that there are times when you're in control of what you're doing and maybe times when you're out of control. And what is that determines whether you're in control or not, if not free will? What do we call that state of being in control of what you're doing or not in control of what you're doing? We have laws on the books that acknowledge this happens to people, but it doesn't fit in that incompatibilist worldview very well at all, because they view free will as a binary. You either have it or you don't, and in their view, you never have it. But in the real world, we have degrees of murder, and these feel right to us. I mean, at least I think so. I think Sapolsky tries to argue that we should try and give up things like this. But what do you think? Should we have degrees?
This is reminding me of horseshoe theory, where it's kind of like you have basic, you know, without getting too pie in the sky philosophical, just humanity comes up with practical solutions to our reality. And then suddenly philosophers come in and dissect everything and try to say, no, it's not really this way. And then other philosophers actually come back and try to incorporate much more into it. And they end up basically coming with the basic result of what humanity evolved before getting philosophical.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, there's one more. Yeah.
Involuntary manslaughter, a killing that stems from a lack of intention to cause death, but involving an intentional act of negligence, which may or may not be premeditated, leading to death. A drunk driving related death is typically involuntary manslaughter.
So when I think about this, and I just think about in my own personal life, like suppose something awful happened to my wife. I would feel a tremendous difference between whether somebody premeditated, harming my wife, killing my wife, or whether it was an accident or a drunk driving, involuntary manslaughter. That I would have a completely different feeling about the culprit in that case, based upon what control they had at the moment. But in an incompatibilist worldview, I'm not sure that that's really justified. I think Sapolsky would argue I probably shouldn't have that emotional response, but we do notice a difference. And why is that? Why do we feel that there's a difference? And I think it's because we recognize that there's something in people that they have control over and something in people that they don't have control over. And that difference, that degree, that capacity for foresight and action is what free will is.
And even beyond that, when you invoke what we've talked about before as our society's kind of having an evolutionary component, you would probably think differently, both to yourself and the safety of your wife, between somebody that was premeditated and intentional. But you also say, well, what, as a society, what do we do if there's somebody who's manifests that they have this ability to do premeditated intentional murder towards another person? You have to treat them differently than somebody who through an act of negligence kills someone. It feels like there's motivation that's legitimate for society to treat them differently in how the justice system handles it.
Right. In both cases, you would say you could make the argument they're victims of circumstance in either case, right? In one case, it's just that the circumstances were pushed back. If I was a first-degree murderer, all the things that led up to it are not so apparent as if I was a drunk driving, accident. If I was a first-degree murderer, it may have happened clear back in my childhood. But the idea is, whatever accident happened in your childhood carried forward, made it happen. So your first-degree murder charge is really kind of an involuntary murder charge. It's just how you look at it. I believe that's how that incompatibilist might have to try and reconcile these things, that there's no free will actually in any of this. That's the incompatibilist view, that nobody's actually making a significant decision. They're all just playing out what's happened. And so these different degrees in the incompatibilist worldview don't make sense, but in the compatibilist worldview, they make a lot of sense, because you're saying free will is not a binary, it's by degree. So that's the main point I'm trying to get out of here. Degree.
All right.
Hitting on it pretty hard, I suppose. Which is the next few slides. I talked about how you can have more or less of free will, and I'm going to give some illustrations here that I think are easy to understand about the idea of more or less free will. So first of all is whether you're imprisoned or handcuffed. You clearly have less capacity to do things when you're in handcuffs. Your free will is constrained, right, as when you're free. So you have more freedom from more physical liberty. This is like, seems so obvious, but it needs to be said that there's a difference in whether or not you can control your body. And this is a quote here from Thomas Hobbes, who is also a compatibilist, one of the early Enlightenment compatibilists, and this is what they focused on quite a bit, is the idea of whether or not a person could engage with their will and cause action to happen. If they would say that's free will. I can go and do whatever it is that my will wants me to do. That's that idea of being free from constraint or imprisoned or handcuffed, but I still have my will that drives me. So that's the basic notion of kind of classical compatibilism. So Thomas Hobbes quote, do you want to read that one quickly?
Yeah. A free man is he that in those things which by his strength and wit he is able to do, is not hindered to do what he has a will to do.
Right. So it's a little bit of a convoluted way of saying, if you're not in handcuffs and you can go, if you want to go pick that thing up, hey, that's your free will, that you can exercise your free will and go and do that. It's physical liberty is one way. And also I should point out that not only can you constrain it, but you can also improve your physical liberty. So for example, when you work out or whatever, you develop more skills, or when you practice, you develop abilities that you didn't have before, and that capacity for action improves your free will. It gives you more options in the future. And so you can have more or less physical liberty, which means more or less potential, more or less free will. Here's another one. So imagine, if you will, that we're in a Squid Game, and the Squid Game is you have to cross a football field 100 yards. Behind you is going to come lasers or machine guns that are going to shoot you up if you don't run across this field. That's why I've got Fry here about ready to run across the minefield. And if you ask yourself, what free will do I have in making it across that minefield? If you know nothing about where those mines are placed, your free will is near zero, right? You're just going to be running willy-nilly. But if you know a little bit about where the mines are placed, or if you can see the mines, or if somebody gives you a map of where the mines are, or if the mines pop up, all these things are items of intelligence. These are items of new information. They give you more opportunities, more things that you can do. They give you more freedom. So again, free will by degrees. And I'm using the idea of crossing a minefield in the notion that there's a difference between something being totally random, which is what it would be if you didn't have a map or anything, and a difference between it being determined, or where you might have a map of what's going on there because you have intelligence into that thing. And this, the quote I have there, which you can read from Dan Dennett's Freedom Evolves, is making this same point.
Okay, in fact, if you are faced with the prospect of running across an open field in which lightning bolts are going to be a problem, you're much better off if their timing and location are determined by something, since then they may be predictable by you and hence avoidable. Determinism is the friend, not the foe, of those who dislike inevitability.
So
So
there,
that
Dennett's, yeah, he's tying back into his notion of being able to avoid these bad outcomes, and having a determined or a knowledge of the environment gives you that ability.
hmm.
What, were you going to say something there?
Well, I'm trying to tie in my head. It's really like this challenge between the ghost in the machine thing versus um, the emergent concept of incompatibility uh, in the setting of determinism, and it really is like, you know, when you study biology, you start out and you look at simple single-celled organisms and you see how they receive stimuli from their environment, and then the stimuli may be something that just causes the follicles on one side to wiggle a little bit more, and so that tends to go towards a potential source of food. And then as complexity of an environment and complexity of the evolutionary mechanisms of the cell increases, then what choices it has and what circuits of response happen, so that it may not be simply going towards food, but it also may be avoiding danger. And then as you layer more and more complexities of the various different game theory sort of stuff that we talk about, how both an individual can evolve and then how societies evolve, and you can see that the system becomes so complex, and there are mechanisms that we may have received the evolutionary advantage of hundreds of thousands of years or generations in the past, but still operate within us today. You could dissect and find the circuits that go into those things, but functionally they form a kind of a fabric upon which your decisions are made. But to some extent, you could even work against them if you chose that you wanted to, because there was some other value that you held that created a reason that it would be a preferable choice to override some of those things. And so I can appreciate how, even though we may have chemistry and physics as the root principles behind what we are as organic beings, they can ultimately manifest in a system that is so complex that it has what is functionally free will or free agency, or the ability to see a variety of potential outcomes and make a rational choice about which one that you choose within a limited set of options and a limited set of data. So I'm not convinced, and you're I think a lot of the times you get out of the church and you hear this argument, and it's almost like the science is settled. There's no free will. Look, we have a
Right.
Stanford neurologist who's told us that we have no free will. We have a soft-spoken neuroscientist, you know, with billionaire money or whatever, telling us to meditate over the fact that we have no free will. We have all these different voices. Why are you even considering it? And it's like, you need, you know, it's always good to have other people say, well, hold on a second, there's another way to look at this thing, and take all of these points of data and just say there's a different way of framing it to understand it that doesn't have some of the problems that maybe you'll have from looking at it in that one single way.
Right. So, Dan Dennett and Sam Harris, both new atheists, well, they're on opposite sides of this free will argument, this discussion. And they've had multiple discussions at various times. And it's really interesting because Dan Dennett is the philosopher. He does have the background in philosophy, while Sam Harris is the neuroscientist. So that's his background. And when they've had those discussions, it's really kind of fascinating, because like what what Dan Dennett says is that, I could see now that not only where you were wrong, but how you were wrong. Like he can really, he gets into it and he's like, okay, I see the mistakes you're making here because you're approaching it as a neuroscientist, but Dan Dennett's approaching it as a philosopher. And as a philosopher, a lot of doing good philosophy is about defining your terms and figuring out what free will is. And instead, a lot of what I think Sapolsky and Harris have is more of this intuitive notion of free will rather than a very clearly defined thing. And then they can rule out that intuitive notion of free will because they feel like in order to have free will, you have to have some sort of indeterminate, some sort of outside influence. They're really arguing against libertarian free will. They're arguing against that ghost in the machine way of viewing the world. And they're not even doing the hard work of saying, but wait, could you have free will in a determined universe? What would that look like? How would it come into being? And that's what I think Dennett is doing, is saying, wait. Let's get back to our natural universe. Forget that we're fighting against libertarianism, because he's also that, and just ask the question, what does free will even mean? What could it be? And that's what his, Freedom Evolves and a lot of his books are about, is trying to define philosophically what free will is, how we have it, and what it's about, rather than just kind of that intuitive notion that I think both Sam and Sapolsky are pushing, which is that, oh, you don't have it because there's no way for it to enter the system. There's no way for it. They're looking for some sort of way for it to get in. And they're saying, well, everything's determined. There's no way. It has to come from outside. And Dennett saying, no. It can come from inside. It's an emergent property, right? That's kind of the main difference, I think. Outside versus inside. Top down versus bottom up. Okay, so here's another example of free will by degrees. And this is something that we're all aware of, and it goes through all of us in our lives. We all come to maturity. We start out as babies with very little free will, very little understanding of the universe. And then as we gain more knowledge, we get better at modeling what's going to happen, get better at figuring out what the consequences to actions will be. We start to interface with our social milieu that we're in. And what happens is you get more and more choices as to what you do. You get to decide how you're going to respond. And so we actually recognize this as a society, that you don't give the ability to drive to an 8-year-old, or a 4-year-old. They don't have those capacities, but you have to have a little bit older. You get 16, will give you the ability to drive. At 18, maybe the ability to vote, and so forth, because we're recognizing this development of the brain gives you greater capacity to make smarter decisions. And so we have baked into our society this notion of free will is coming on. You're getting more capacity by degrees. And it makes sense to all of us in that context, but for some reason our incompatibilists come back and say, no, ignore that, pretend like that doesn't exist. There is no difference in free will between a baby and an adult, ultimately, because it's all just determined by precursor events. Compatibilist says, no, there's a very noticeable difference between a baby and an adult. So,
well, I can't believe that they would argue that there's no difference between a baby and an adult in terms of
capacity. They would say, oh, there's you could do way more as an adult, right? But in terms of the ability to make a decision, that they would say that it's still just an illusion. That
okay. Well, no, I can understand that. If their position is that you don't have free will, you are simply the product of systems over which you have no control, then an infant with a lesser degree of capacity has just as much free will as an adult with their full competent faculties, and that amount of free will is none. And
that exactly correct. Yeah, they say it's none in both cases, but your intuition is like, no, there's a difference. I have more capacity as an adult than I did as a baby. And if we take free will to be that capacity for foresight and for taking action and all these other things, non-coercion, to me, it seems almost inescapable that you definitely have more freedom, more will, more ability to do things as an adult than you did as a child. And that fits with the compatibilist worldview, but incompatibilists struggle with it, I think, because free will is zero in all cases.
Like what would disappear if they acknowledged a small dimension of free will?
Well,
is that a house of cards that relies on no free will, or?
That's a good question. In one of the discussions between Harris and Dennett that they had at a restaurant towards the end of that, Harris admits that really he's more concerned about libertarian free will and says, this idea of compatibilist free will, where we're still dealing with a scientific universe where everything's acting in accordance to natural laws, and he admits that it's perfectly okay to act as if compatibilist free will exists. He doesn't really have a problem with the notion of it being, how we act as if. He just believes that it's not correct.
So he has free will derangement syndrome.
Yeah, he kind of does. He's got that, like, as long as we're not talking about the ghost in the machine, you guys are fine over in philosophy
Okay.
land. He just wants to make sure nobody is getting into that,
So as long
Deterministic.
as nobody's saying, "Hey, I think, therefore I am, therefore there's a metaphysical component to my existence, which then opens the door to the possibility of God," then then he's okay as long as you're not using any framing like that, I guess.
Yeah,
Well,
and I think that's fair. That it's like I want to preclude the possibility of an existence of God, so I'm going to make sure I double down on my incompatibilism. Yeah.
okay, well, let's read this quote. We live in a world that is subjectively open, and we are designed by evolution to be informavores, epistemically hungry seekers of information, in an endless quest to improve our purchase on the world, the better to make decisions about our subjectively open future. From Freedom Evolves, Dan Dennett.
Yeah. I believe, again, that's a really beautiful quote. A world that is subjectively open. That means, for me, subjectively, as I look into the future, I can see all these possibilities, right? And I
Mhm.
want to be able to make better decisions about my possibilities. And so I'm an informavore, right? I want to get more information so that I can make better decisions. And as I do so, my purchase on the world uh, improves. It increases. I have greater free will.
Which is really just all about you getting to the point where you can reproduce. And so it's basically all about sex.
In the end, it is. Well,
All right. So
and
let's keep
survival.
going.
Yeah. Okay, so to kind of start bringing some of this together, now that I think we've talked about some of the different elements, I'm going to start trying to summarize some things and then walk through a few ideas. So first of all, the idea behind free will here is that it's an emergent property from lower order processes like intelligence and consciousness. It developed gradually from simple look ahead modeling, trying to figure out what's going to happen in the future. And that's the idea of it evolved, right? We developed more and more capacity for this over time. Animals, other creatures also have, to a certain degree, more or less, some kind of free will, we would say, within their own constraints, right?
Hmm.
Uh, so that, free will is not necessarily limited only to humans, which is kind of, I guess, a little bit unique. And this may be my own opinion too. I'm not even sure that Dan Dennett necessarily buys into this, but the idea that your free will is directly commensurate with your ability to project futures. That I probably have a certain level of free will that would be different than a dog, but a dog might be able to think about choices that it's going to make, have some opportunities within that, and do have some free will, even though it's still being driven by its will, by its desires to eat, sleep, reproduce, whatever it might be driven by. That will is still there. It has choices in how it's going to make that. So anyway, I'm getting into the weeds about whether or not other things have free will.
It's always
Oh,
fun to look at those experiments where they look at different animals and try to determine if some animals have some of the capacity that that we have, just in terms of like delayed gratification or investment in the future, or being able to predict other agents that they may encounter and avoid dangers in that way. Because certainly there are various levels of that sophistication in an ability of animals to model their situation and take action. So I can see what you're talking about.
yeah. So I don't get too lost in the weeds. I'll get back on track here. So consciousness is our interface with deterministic chaos. That's a deterministic chaos is a term I've heard Dennett use many times, and it's the idea that even though we live in a world of natural law where everything is happening, it's chaotic for us because we can't predict what's going to happen out of all this stuff happening and interacting. For example, as far as we're concerned, flipping a coin is a deterministic event, right? Everything that went into that flipping of a coin could be drawn out and figured out, the weight of it, the flip, the spin, the timing, and in theory you could calculate whether that's going to land heads or tails. But because there are so many elements in it, it might as well be random or chaotic.
Mhm.
And so that's why we use the flipping of a coin typically as a random or a proxy for randomness. And our consciousness is our interface with that deterministic chaos that we're always engaged with. It's always trying to discover the patterns, see what's going on in the world. But even though the world is deterministic, it's well beyond our ability to predict everything that's going on. And so we have to be able to model what's going on, which is the next idea. Free will is the modeling, decision, and action aspect of our consciousness. So we're modeling the future, we're making decisions, we're taking action. That's the free will component of the brain, or at least, that's what I'm trying to get at. And then I'm trying to make the case that consciousness and free will are interdependent. They're very closely tied together. You have consciousness so that you can have freedom in your decisions. And the reason you have freedom in decisions is because you're consciously aware of certain things in your environment. So that's kind of my tying some of these elements together here. So what do you think? How you feeling so far about where we're going?
Well, I'm feeling like this is intuitive. It makes sense with my experience as a human, and feels much more coherent as a philosophy. And then it's free from some of the there always tends to be like some political implications for the lack of free will that end up being, the after conversation. As soon as you determine that everybody is shaped by their environment and society, then there's now an important reason for us to take control of the environment and society and make sure that everybody is equal. And it just tends to be aligned with a particular political outcome. And ironically, it's a political outcome that has the effect of limiting free will whenever you see any societies actually implement it, because they happen to be trying to implement it over people that aren't simply pawns on a chessboard that get moved around by their environment. They have a sense of agency and they respond to incentives. And so there's that.
Yeah, and I think you've hit on something that's brilliant, right? That if the incompatibilist notion is right, that we don't have free will, that we are just squeezed out products of our environment and our genes, well, then all you would need to do is change the environment and genes, right? And you should be able to get a new being out of it. And a lot of your major political movements actually turn on this idea that they will take the people who are not on board with whatever their new political machination is and send them where? To re-education camps. We'll send them off to get them in line with the proper way of thinking. Get your thinking, your free will needs to be squashed and put back into fitting in with that collective, because we have an idea for a utopian society where somehow everybody's going to make sense of what is right, and we're going to control all the variables, right? That's kind of the idea. We're going to ignore deterministic chaos and pretend like we can get some sort of handle on it. So one of the things that people struggle with is like how do we get any sort of randomness into this deterministic world? A lot of the arguments about the origin of free will end up going into crazy places like quantum mechanics, because they start getting into the idea of, well, in order for there to be any sort of true decision making, there has to be something indeterminate, something that it is not controlled by prior causes. And that's where they start getting into this idea of deep down in between the molecules at the quantum fabric of reality, there's quantum indeterminacy, and that indeterminacy is bubbling up into, they actually call this, Roger Penrose, microtubules. Microtubules are in the brain, and they hold on to some of this quantum indeterminacy long enough that the decisions that you're making are genuinely free. And then the idea is that kind of produces multiverses or whatever, that you go out and it's all happening from this quantum idea. And the whole reason they even chase the idea of you requiring this for free will is because they can't accept or won't accept the idea that you could have free will in a completely determined universe. So to that end, there is always something that's indeterminate at any moment, and that is the future. We never know what the future is, and that is really important in making sense of this whole notion of compatibilism. It's the future that we're worried about when we're talking about this, and what the possible outcomes are, not what brought you so much to this point, even though that's, that is important. But the interface, the thing where free will resides, is in that modeling of indeterministic, or not deterministic, deterministically chaotic futures. I'm kind of rambling there a bit, but hopefully you're getting at or understanding what I'm getting at. the task of the mind, I'll read this one. The task of the mind is to produce future. As the poet Paul Valéry once put it, a mind is fundamentally an anticipator, an expectation generator. It mines the present for clues, which it refines with the help of the materials it has saved from the past, turning them into anticipations of the future. And then it acts rationally on the basis of those hard-won anticipations. So this is my answer to the question of where does the indeterminacy come from that allows you the freedom within the universe? And it's the future. It's the different models of the future that you could choose from.
All right. Do you have more?
Oh yeah, I still got a few more.
All right, well, let's keep going because we've got some comments that are going to be fun to go over once we get there. But
okay, yeah, I don't see the comments right now, but we can definitely get to them. Or if you want, we can take them now. Or...
No. Let's do this. I'm trying to frame in my head what would the counter argument be to some of the stuff that you're saying here. Like, how would the incompatibilists deal with this question of the future? Because they might say, well, of course, all of the prior inputs going into your decision making are shaping how you're going to anticipate and act for the future. There's nothing that makes that incompatible with our philosophy. It's just that the engine that is processing that determination, is that choice, is itself a product of everything that came before.
Yes. A little later on here, I talk a bit about the idea of could have done otherwise, which is really key to a lot of people's notions of what free will is. I'll get to that slide in a minute because it's kind of important, I think, to talk about could have done otherwise and that notion. But we probably don't need to spend much time on this slide, which is just kind of a reiteration of some of the things we've been talking about, that I believe that with compatibilist free will, because of these reasons, we do have moral and personal responsibility, which means it is within certain degrees rational to place praise or blame, because we do have this kind of responsibility. Even the word responsibility, I think, is often quite interesting. I mean, the etymology of the word responsibility is the ability to respond. And so when you say that you have responsibility, you're really saying, if somebody were to ask me about this, could I provide reasons? Could I explain myself, right? And that's what responsibility really is ultimately about, is do you have justifications for what it is that you've done? And so when we talk about responsibility for your personal actions and your moral actions, I think compatibilist free will does give you that ability to say, oh yeah, I can respond for that. I know why I did most of those things, even if your explanation for it happened a little bit after the fact of when the decision was made. You can still respond and take responsibility for it. If that makes sense.
I think this is actually a really important slide, because this, after you hear all the arguments, this becomes like the point of contention for everything in these discussions, because the downstream effect for people saying there is no free will is that and therefore it is unethical to hold people responsible or to give praise for good or bad actions, because everybody is simply the product of everything that came before, over which they had no choice. So it would be unethical to punish them for things over which they had no choice. And so I don't know, open all the prisons and make everyone free from the consequences of their actions. Well, that's probably a mischaracterization of that. But where do you see those discussions going, and what's the difference between the compatibilist and the incompatibilist approach to that?
For the most part, and Sam Harris talks about this at the end of his book, there's, at least for Sam, he's not talking about a reformation of the justice system. He's kind of like, what we've got is pretty good. Like, we're doing the best we can. Instead, he approaches it like, we should just learn to hate people less. that we should understand that there are a lot more factors going into the decisions that people make than we are aware of, and many of them they might not be, completely cognizant of. So his contention is that it reduces the emotional valence of things down to where you're less likely to get upset and angry. And his contention is it helps us to be more rational actors in the world when we stop thinking of people as being so responsible for their actions and treat them more as I want to say victims. He doesn't use that word, but more as objects, I guess, in the world, so that you're less likely to see them as with that view of hate that might just be a result of tribalism. So I think Sam's main point is he wants to cool the discussion, I think, from what it's been, and make it more aligned with people not having as much moral and personal responsibility as we think they have.
I think this is particularly brought into contrast when you think about substance abuse and the actions that people will take in pursuit of getting their fix, for example, where you could have somebody who, up until their encounter with a particular substance, was by all measures somebody who would follow the normal social norms of society and wouldn't have a particular issue. But as soon as they interact with a substance that has this addictive property, suddenly all of their choices, all of their decisions get colored by that, and they may take criminal actions in pursuit of that. And so if your society is only focused on the punitive side of things, you may blind yourself to the fact that there is some input to this that could and should be addressed as a society. And so I can see the argument of that as not being totally unbased.
Yeah, I agree that often there are causal factors that we don't take into account when we're trying to mete out justice or punishment. And I think everybody should read the Incompatibilist books, and because they are very convincing and they do make excellent points. But at the same time, I also think it's worth thinking a little bit harder afterwards to say, yeah, but we do interact with one another, and there are a lot of things where there are degrees of what appear to be free will. Maybe there's more to the story than just the binary switch of off and on that that incompatibilists tend to treat free will as. And that's what I'm trying to get at. Is it's not just a binary. It's not just off or on. You have it or you don't. It's something that evolves. You got more or less of. So I talked earlier about the category error. This is a bit of a criticism of the incompatibilist view of the world. So if free will emerges from the complex brain interaction and is a higher order function, if you're down there looking at the individual neurons, you will not find any evidence of free will. Just like you won't find evidence of consciousness, you won't find evidence of intelligence or anything else. And you won't find it at a quantum level. And some people believe in like panpsychism, right? That the idea that consciousness is universal and we're all just kind of picking up radio frequencies of it, and it's coming down. And so they'll look for free will at some sort of, galactic level, that maybe there's a pan-psychic consciousness that we're just tapping into. And the idea behind all of this is that I think these are all mistaken ways of looking at free will. You shouldn't be looking for free will juice. You shouldn't be looking for something that grants you free will, because it isn't going to come from outside the system. It's inside the brain already. It's a product of the brain. And I think people are making a category error when they go trying to look at it at the level of individual neurons or molecules or, atoms or whatever else. Okay, I wanted to get to this earlier, the could have done otherwise trap. So this is a common intuition that in order for free will to be genuine, you have to have actual possible outcomes, right? And so they'll get into this idea of, well, I didn't have free will if I couldn't have actually done something different. If all the conditions were the same and I chose that thing, well, then I didn't actually exercise free will, right? And you get into that idea of multiverses that, oh, in this universe, I made this choice, bow, and it spawned a multiverse over there. And in this, I made that choice, and the quantum mechanics pushed me off into another universe. And then, pretty soon you're in the Marvel MCU, and there's all these universes going everywhere. And it's the idea of that free will it generates multiverses or something. And I'm like, wait, be careful. What you're doing is you're trapping yourself. The could have done otherwise trap. You're thinking about the only way that free will could be genuine is if I could go back. And I want to say that intuition is wrong. Because first of all, you can't test it. There's no way to prove. If you wanted to go back and see if you could do something otherwise, you'd have to time travel, which you can't do. So there's no way to prove that you could have done otherwise. Besides, if we live in a deterministic universe, you would have to rewind everything. In other words, it'd be like rewinding the tape. You have to reset all your variables, which would take you right back to whatever position you were in when you were going to make whatever choice you were going to make. And you would, under that condition, almost certainly end up making the exact same choice. In fact, deterministically, you would make the same choice. Does that mean you don't have free will? My argument is no, you still have free will, because your free will is about making the decision of what's going to happen into those future. It's not about actually having those futures become actualized. You may have models of the future that you don't choose, and by not choosing those doesn't mean that those had to have actually come into existence somewhere in order for those to have been like legitimate potentialities. So that's my solution.
How many drugs do you have to take to go down these different pathways of? It just sounds like a bunch of philosophers hopped up on some sort of psychedelics talking about potential futures and rewinding the past.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think that's why free will is kind of one of those very fruitful areas that you can talk about forever. We can just get lost in it. So I have the solution there. David Hume has the idea of hypothetical liberties, which is the idea that when you're considering what you're going to do next, you're hypothetically considering things. And even though you never choose them, those models are still valuable. They're hypotheticals. Mm-hmm. They don't have to be actual. And so it's a useful fiction, those other models. They don't have to be actual, right? And so then in the end, free will is just basically about modeling and forecasting of current and future events and then pursuing those ends. And kind of forget about all this past thing when you're dealing with free will. You don't have to spend quite so much time about all the conditions leading in if you're focused on, well, what are we trying to decide for the future and what are our elements? So the could have done otherwise trap to me feels like a loop that you can get stuck in where you're trying to figure out, well, how could there be multiverses and that sort of thing? And I don't think it's even necessary at all. Okay, so I'm getting near the end of kind of what I wanted to talk about here. So just to kind of sum up my idea of what compatibilist free will is and is not. So basically, compatibilist free will, it's graduated. It involves self-control, autonomy, non-coercion. It involves the accurate forecasting of futures, and it is our primary source of moral and personal responsibility. Compatibilist free will, in contrast, is not binary. It doesn't think that you either have it or you don't. It is not obsessed with these could have done otherwise intuitions, and it's not driven by this microtubule quantum fueled magic, that there's something magic about free will that we have to still discover in order for free will to be genuine. We don't have to do that, I don't think. I think we have enough in our current philosophical understanding and brain understanding to say, no, actually we do have a degree of free will that we can use to base our justice and moral systems on. So one of my last slides here from the poet, philosopher, lyricist, author, musician, and Royal Order of Canada. These are the some of the lyrics from Neil Peart, drummer of Rush, about free will from the song Free Will. And I actually think that this is a pretty good summary of my position, incidentally. So do you want to read these kind of verses here?
Sure. There are those who think that life has nothing left to chance, with a host of holy horrors to direct our aimless dance. A planet of playthings, we dance on the strings of power we cannot perceive. The stars aren't aligned, or the gods are maligned. You can choose a ready guide. Is this the same?
Yeah, actually, there was a sign that, yeah, it was cut off. There's actually, I'm sorry about there. Yeah, stars aren't aligned, or the gods are aligned. Blame is better to give than receive. That part was cut off. Blame is better to give than receive. Yeah.
You can choose a ready guide in some celestial voice. If you choose not to decide, you've still made a choice. You can choose from phantom fear and kindness that can kill. I will choose a path that's clear. I will choose free will.
Right. So at the end of all this discussion, when you get back to free will, there's kind of a little bit of, well, what am I going to personally believe about free will? And I think you can make the case for incompatibilism. You know, I'm trying to say that this is an unsettled sort of area of discovery. It's something for us to think about philosophically and work at. But there's also a level of choice involved here, I think, at the end, that you're like, well, what do you think about free will? Well, I will choose free will because of the positive notions of how it can motivate you into thinking. I can have more free will. I can have more physical ability to do stuff. I can have more intelligence to do stuff. I can, you know, I can gain more abilities, allowing me to model more prospective futures, giving me more freedom and more free will. It's a positive way of looking at the universe rather than the negative that I've just been, you know, buried under circumstance.
I think that's
basically it. These are just the key concepts. So yeah.
Okay, I mean, it's reminding me a lot about when you listen to Bednar in the Mormon Church talk about free agency. A lot of it is, it's not just to sit around and scratch your head about free agency. It's to give you a motivation to grow and to learn and to adapt and to become something. And of course, they're tying it to becoming the thing that the church wants to shape and model you as, but it at least gives you a kind of an engine to drive your journey, rather than a reason to say I'm simply the product of my environment and societies, and if I can't do something, it's because I've not been given the environment or the inputs that would grant me the ability to do that, rather than taking a more proactive stance towards it. And you have Hypnotoad.
Yeah, I figured that would be a good one to end on.
Well, hold on, go back. There was one more slide there that you skipped over. I wanted to make sure that we...
Yeah, okay, let me...
the benefit of all the work that you put into this.
So this was just the key concepts.
Okay, so compatibilism is consistent with determinism. It does not straddle with libertarian free will or rely upon incompatibilism.
Yeah.
Free will as we want to see free will as something that comes in degrees, more or less of, not just a binary. Free will is accurate forecasting, self-control, autonomy, and non-coercion. When you say non-coercion, you're talking about you're making choices in the absence of somebody coercing you?
Yes. Yes. Okay. So like if somebody puts a gun to your head, they've taken away effectively most of your free will, right? You don't really have nearly the choices you had. And so that's what we mean by non-coercion, is somebody's trying to force you into making a decision or a choice or doing something. Yeah. The idea of degrees is very important. You know, you may still have a little bit of free will. Maybe you can push them and get away, but it's taken away a lot of your options. Yeah.
But you're actually exercising free will because you understand. It's like that thing about if you know where the lightning's going to strike, you can make decisions that account for that deterministic thing. So you've identified a threat, you know that it's real, and so you're making a decision in that landscape. And so you're still making a decision. Free will is an emergent property of brains, like intelligence or consciousness. And I think that those two things are necessary inputs to free will, and there may be others as well. Looking for free will at the quantum, atomic, or molecular level is a category error. This is also kind of like there's no free will sauce that you're going to find if you dissect the brain. It's the result of the sum of the parts is somehow greater than the whole.
But how that's you get the idea of emergence. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And could have done otherwise is confusion. Don't go that pathway. And good news, you have free will and you can get even more.
Yes, that's good news, everyone. If you bought into this, if you bought into the idea that your brain is free will, hopefully you're going, oh, you know, maybe I do have a little bit of free will. Maybe I could have some more. A little bit of autonomy, a little bit of self-control, that sort of stuff. As I look into the future, and I think that's a better way to view the world. And of course, I also want to stress, man, I have just barely touched the surface on this stuff. So we could really get into weeds on all sorts of things.
Okay, well, let's do a couple of things. Let's go ahead and allow people to call in if they want to. If you have some observations about either the presentation here or the discourse over free will as you've encountered it in various segments of the online world and in person, then by all means, give us a call at 210-422-2222. We'd love to hear from you. And let's go back and see if there are any comments that might be worth commenting on. Let's see here. Okay. Let's see. We have Dracosophos says it is all about functional determinism. Troy's right. It's a very shallow reactionary stance when one leaves. And I'm hoping that by broadening the conversation and saying there's different ways of considering this question of free will, then maybe people in the ex-Mormon community can have a little bit more open mind about this question rather than simply internalizing, some particular philosophy. Particularly, it's just so funny seeing the various ex-Mormons discover this, and then it becomes part of their discourse. Let's have an episode on free agency and free will. You don't have any. I think Zelf on the Shelf was particularly embracing this particular approach of things.
Like to me, and I don't want to be too, because I really have a lot of respect for the incompatibilists, but I think it's kind of the easy path, right? There's a part of me that whenever I think about the incompatibilist way of thinking, it becomes very, well, binary. It becomes kind of shallow, like a reactionary stance, that it's kind of like, I'm just going to say there's no free will, zero, just reduce it all the way down and get rid of it, rather than going, wait a minute, what do I mean by free will? Which seems to me that should be the first question you ask. Instead, they just kind of into it and say, well, free will is just what, the ability to make decisions. All your decisions are all made before you are aware of them. Therefore, you don't have any, and you're done. You just kind of stop right there instead of going, wait, is there a difference between somebody in handcuffs and not? What is that difference? Is that freedom? Do you have that? What are we talking about? And so you end up realizing that there's more to the discussion than just kind of that real quick, almost glib. Well, that's why, again, Sam Harris's free will book is thin, and you will get the idea of incompatibilist free will very easily. People get it quickly, but compatibilist free will, man, you got to spend some time thinking about what your brain's doing and what you have control over, what you don't. And it becomes complex and graduated and shaded. And you start to realize, like, just like with the murder by degrees, that we live in a very complex world, and you don't always have control over yourself. Sometimes you do. And what control means, changes at different times. But what we should be working towards is always having maximal self-autonomy, maximal self-control, maximal free will, both for our own, health. But I think also that's best for society as well, when all of us are interacting at our best, most honest way of being agents in the universe, where we're not trying to necessarily fit in with somebody else's idea of what we need to be doing, but instead we're taking personal responsibility for all of our actions and for our thoughts, and saying, this is the locus right here inside my head of where the responsibility lies for the actions being taken by this body, not in the systems that have created me. It's fundamentally bottom up versus top down.
But it's so alluring, because you can suddenly escape all responsibility by saying that you're the result of your system, rather than saying, I didn't do as good as I could have done in some particular endeavor. And just like I think there's a psychological, like, desirability to avoid having to confront personal shortcomings or things like that. So there may be kind of a psychological impulse that you want to examine and guard against if that is your motivation. We have an interesting comment here from Bryce Graham. The interesting question to me isn't whether free will exists or not, but where you draw the line for personal responsibility. My question to compatibilists: should a person be morally responsible for the way they are, even if they had no say in any of the conditions that lead to them becoming that way? Legally, sure, but morally, to the point where they can be disregarded, cast aside, and punitively punished for the sake of it. What do you take?
I think that one of the great things about the incompatibilists, and pointing out how much is out of your control, because there's a lot of it, and the incompatibilists make a good point, helps to build empathy for people who are down on their luck, who are having difficulty. And I think that is the primary value of looking at that incompatibilist worldview. And so I think everybody should be aware of really what you think you have for free will is not as broad or as expansive as you might initially think. It's good to have that incompatibilist notion of determinism pressing in on you, that I do have limits on what I can or can't do. I am indeed a product of my environment. I'm not completely free of it, but I do have some capacity within a range to make some decisions and choices under most conditions, right? Assuming my brain is healthy. And that's where you kind of put the emphasis. So if you're looking at somebody else, you should be very aware that you don't know everything that went into their history. You don't know how they got there. You don't know what their brains are or whatever. And so you need to have a lot of latitude for allowing them to behave in the way that they're doing, and a lot of understanding. This is, I think, a good thing to have out of it. But at the same time, you can also put the locus of responsibility there. Well, whatever problems are happening are in that system of that person, that body or that brain. Mm-hmm. So maybe we can help that person. If it's a drug addicted issue where they've lost control of themselves, right? They're so addicted that they can't do anything else. Well, then you can intervene and start laying your free will to maybe help them until they get control of the substance or whatever, right? I can see kind of this way of helping each other, lean on each other's freedoms.
Yeah, and certainly there's questions as a society that you have to have in terms of allowing as much, liberty and freedom, but then when somebody's actions interfere with another person, then some sort of adjudication has to happen. And then there are extremes in that regard where for the safety of society and for the safety of others, there has to be consequences that severely limit an individual's freedom. And so, what frequently comes up in these discussions are things, there's first, looking back historically, people used to say that homosexuality was some sort of unnatural aberration of the human condition that required society to guard against it, and and so laws were made, people were abused in other ways. And so now we've come to a more freedom oriented perspective on that mode of a human. But there are other more extreme things that people say, well, actually, the one that frequently comes up is pedophilia. People say that, for a person to be sexually attracted to a child is the result of, these indeterminate inputs into who they are. And so we should not view them with the type of judgment morally or legally that we do view them. But it's like, how do you square that then with the need to protect the vulnerable in our community? And, even if I think this has happened a few times where people interested in examining and studying and helping people with this disorder still consider it to be a disorder, but want to try to see it as a disorder as any other disorder, even if it does have legal implications as things like psychopathy and other stuff do. And so, like, I'm totally here for all of the criticisms that you'll hear about coming up with this term minor attracted person. And if any researcher or health mental professional tries to make the argument that there are minor attracted people and we need to see them as having a condition that we can explore ways to help them, frequently the ultra conservatives will say you're a pedophile apologist because you're trying to help these people, and they'll get demonized and then they'll get blasted on social media. Whereas, like, understanding that there may be inputs into that, and if we're not able to actually study that then we're preventing any form of help from happening to people who may have that affliction and don't want to offend. I don't know, it's a complex sort of thing, but it's those outlier cases that I think bring this argument to focus about what do you do. Because if you do take that pure deterministic stance, then you say, well, who's to say what's wrong? They're just a product of nature.
Right. And I think what you're hitting on there, at least to me, speaks a little bit to this backwards thinking about how I arrived at my position versus the forward thinking about what we're going to do in the future. And so, like with a minor attracted person, I think you could arrive at saying, well, yes, you are not responsible for those attractions. That's something that's come about. But do you have the capacity to think through what might be the outcome of pursuing those things, both for yourself or for the other people? Just because you have these inclinations does not mean that we need to allow you to act on them, or that they're naturally just good or going to have a good outcome that we want in society. And that's where free will starts to come in, modeling those futures. Okay, I've arrived at this point. Now I'm going to model out some futures and make some decisions about where I want to go within the capacity of what I can or cannot do. You know, somebody may be so minor attracted, they're so wrapped up in this that you know, they can't change that, but they might have enough to control their behavior and not act on it, right? Maybe somebody else might be able to, you know, through cognitive behavioral therapy or something, start to change some of how their brain operates, and so they don't feel that pressure so much. You can start to change, you know, actually the way that your brain functions in response to things. And I'm sure you're aware of this, you know, that there are a lot of cognitive behavioral therapies where you get exposed to things and then you practice a response, which is really training your neurons to respond in a certain way. And then over time, you can start to actually shape your brain and the way it responds. And that's all free will. It's all you making changes into who you are as a being based on your knowledge and intelligence of what those changes will make over time into the future, rather than being, oh, I'm fated to be this way and I can't do anything about it. Yeah. At least
that's where I think I've heard discussions, but you know, on the incompatibilist side, where even though they may say that, you know, yeah, nature may have shaped people to commit certain acts that we deem to be crimes, we still do have to actually imprison people for certain types of crimes. We still do, just for the safety of society and for the safety of vulnerability. Even if we say, yeah, well, maybe you're a product of your environment and a product of the deterministic world, but you're still going to be behind bars because you pose a threat to other people. So I think that it doesn't preclude you from still believing in some form of justice. It's just that how you frame that may be a little bit different. And maybe it would predispose to a more humane justice system, but I get a little bit leery in some of the other political directions that ends up getting people in. Okay, let's see if we have any other comments here. If every decision in your life is framed through a Mormon lens, you just might not have agency. And this is kind of like the argument that you'll hear frequently from people. It's like, all those religions, they're brainwashed. You know, they no longer make free choices of their own. They are simply only operating in the way that the group wants them to make. What do you make of that?
Yeah, to me, this is getting back into that degrees of freedom, right? That you do have a framing that you're viewing the world through, and you are probably constrained by whatever that framing is to a degree. But I don't think that is a zero. It doesn't, you know, reduce your agency to zero, nor does it, you know, extend beyond that. So if I'm, you know, if I grew up Scientology, I would have a different framing on the world, which would impact how I model the future, how my brain interacts with things, which would impact my free will and my agency. And it's quite likely that I would have, well, I don't know, a lesser amount on the presumption that, you know, Scientology doesn't have the modeling of the universe quite accurate. And so my free will or my ability to understand the universe is compromised, and I'm reduced in my capacity. This might be the way to look at it. Potentially, you know, I'm a lot of this is very speculative. So yeah.
Yeah. A lot of it also causes me to reflect that, you know, in any relationship with other people in any society, there are kind of like social rules and norms and boundaries that constitute restrictions on free will. You know, the way that you talk to another person when they offend you in some way, or the way that you try to get what you want from the people around you, like there's ways in which that will work and a society can cohese together, and there are ways in which, you know, if you break those social norms, you're going to get ousted. And so there's a, you know, you're always playing within the limitations of proper behavior and everything. It's just, what is the source of those? If the sources of those is, you know, people coming together as individuals may be different from people coming together under the umbrella of a particular ideology that may be religious, or, you know, certainly political or other types of ideology that can shape the rules of engagement, so to speak, that constitute a form of restriction on your agency. But it's a type that you're operating within. No matter where you go, you can never escape it. Okay, so we don't have any calls, and we're hitting the 2-hour mark. So any final thoughts before we close down for today?
I can't think of any quick off the cuff final thoughts. I did have one thought as you were speaking there at the end that I thought might be worth touching on, is that if free will is a product of our brains, right? I think that also makes a case that the unit of society that we probably want to focus on is the individual, right? Because that's where the brain is at the level of the individual, and so we should probably construct our society with as much attention on protecting the rights of the individual, so that each person has as much capacity to do whatever they're going to do. It's that pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. This whole notion of free will underpins the Enlightenment project that you see, from Jefferson, from Hobbes and Hume, Locke. The idea that the individual is responsible for their own actions through their brain, and so we put our society based around protecting the rights of the individual is completely related to how you view free will. Oh, one more thought. We talked about it a little bit before, but I think that what we're going to be facing in the next few years is AI that is dealing with free will. I think because in a materialist universe where the substrate that makes our brain, it doesn't have to be neurons. It can be transforms, which is what are in large language models, right? And so once they start to become motivated to pursue ends, I think we will be asking ourselves the question within the next 4 years of whether or not AI has free will, whether or not it's making its own decisions. And I do have a history of making crazy predictions like this, but they've been right. I've made
Which one did you predict correctly?
Well, I predicted it hasn't quite. Well, maybe it has. I predicted that we would pass the Turing test in 2024, which is this year, and I predicted that back in 2000. So I predicted about 20 years ago, 22 years ago. I actually picked a day by 2024. There's on my page, I have a video called "The Timeline for the AI Takeover," which basically tried to lay out how AI is going to take us over, and we're right on target with what I laid out there.
I feel like there's been an internal control placed on AI. And I remember hearing in the early generations of AI, they were making systems that were self-evolving, where as the AI existed, it was learning and growing and increasing in capacity. And that's where I started to hear like software engineers and Google engineers terrified. And they would lay hints about, there's something really scary there. We're not going to release this to the public. And then this new paradigm that we're seeing with ChatGPT and other LLMs, it's where you train a model and it has a static mode of being, and then you can interact with it in sessions, and it will use its algorithm to interface with you. But then the next time you interface with it, you're starting back again at its default setting. So it doesn't have an internal evolutionary growth component to it. It simply exists as a model trained with certain parameters that you can interface with. And I wonder if it's kind of like keeping a brain in a jar that you can interface with, that you've cut off its ability to grow and evolve. And so you get some functionality to it, but anytime maybe you'll make a bigger brain that's even better, but you've cut off its ability to remember. Maybe it will have a form of consciousness, but it will always return back to one point in time, and you'll engage with it again. And I wonder if that's kind of a stopgap against it, outgrowing humanity.
Yeah, and I think you've hit on something brilliant there. One of the things that we can do as humans is we self-edit, right? We go and we change who we are over time. If an AI could do that, that now you're starting to push on genuine free will. It's going to be able to, self-edit stuff. If you watch the Westworld, right? In Westworld, they're static, right? They're put in all the agents. What do they call them in the show? They were not guests, but hosts.
Yeah,
hosts. Yeah. So the hosts would be running on their restricted loop, right? And just like you said, they're the brain in the jar. But then because they're often being exposed to suffering, what happens is in fact, that's a key part of Westworld, is the suffering aspect causes their loops inside their brain to start looking for solutions to the suffering, which causes them to start being able to self-edit and become aware that it was the suffering that squoze out the notion of free will in the Westworld show. Anyway, we're kind of getting in the weeds, but that suggests.
Well, I love pulling from movies from this. Now, there's this famous scene with the Merovingian in The Matrix where he talks about causality. Is he drawing upon any of these traditions that you talked about today, or do you remember that scene?
I don't remember that scene in particular, but a lot of The Matrix touches on these themes very much, right? There are many scenes about Neo making a choice or needing to make a choice, and the blue pill or the red pill, and is that a free choice? I don't know, right? That there's kind of a lot of jokes about I choose this. Oh, of course you do. The whole thing is like where does your free will begin and end?
Well, I think it's interesting that you put your finger on the idea that if you take this compatibilist perspective, you will share something in common with the libertarian philosophical perspective, in that you will find that the focus of a society should be on the agency of the individual and on maximizing their agency, and that you'll maximize the freedom of a society by focusing on the individual agent's freedom. And I just can't help but contrast that between, almost to the T, every person that I've seen who takes the "we have no free will" perspective, the deterministic incompatibilist perspective. It is a collectivist perspective that they end up having. We have to give more power to the forces in society that shape the environment so that we can minimize the harm to those people who may have been given, a lesser degree of inputs, or however. I don't even, it escapes me how they frame it, but that's that downstream political implication of this question that seems to always come up.
Right. The idea that we could plug into a galaxy brain, like somehow if all the people who are in power could see all the elements, they could tell us what we needed to do perfectly and shape us. The third season of Westworld has that Rehoboam, right? The big machine that's predicting everybody in the world, and then touching things to make stuff happen. It's that idea of oh well, if we just had some central power that could put everything right, and you end up with that collectivist. Let's just vote our way into some sort of big agency that's going to force all of us into doing the right thing. Not a good idea, generally speaking, and it also takes away from all of the individual creative abilities of all of us who are acting as individuals. So yes, I agree with you that the libertarian people who believe in a spirit and the compatibilists will find common ground around the idea of the individual being a core unit of society, as opposed to a collective, which tends to be more on the incompatibilist side. Not always, but.
All right, well, let's go ahead and end it there. And certainly if there are any comments that are in the comments below this on YouTube, then Troy has a record of hopping on and responding. So if you have any questions for Troy, I'm sure he'll be able to answer your questions if you leave them down below. If you want to see more conversations like this, then feel free to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. And perhaps this will show up on your feed a little bit more. And we're hoping to get back into the swing of our religion as an evolutionary faith, with faith standing for framework of ideals, actions, tradition and heritage, looking at kind of an evolutionary perspective of religion and what it represents. I think the next one I want to hit on is the Lisa Simpson as the iconoclast one, because that's always a good discussion about what to do with your faith today that may be rooted in something different in the past. So with that being said, then, Troy, thank you so much for an engaging conversation. It gives me a lot of things to think about next time I hear people denigrating the concept of free will. And until next time, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff. Take care.